Welcome to Revenge with Luna. The grout lines between the bathroom tiles were the last thing I focused on before the floor came up to meet me. I remember thinking how strange it was. That in that moment, dizzy, shaking, barely able to lift my arms, my brain decided to notice the grout. Dark in the corners. Needs cleaning. My mother-in-law had pointed that out just last week, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, her voice carrying that particular sweetness she used when she wanted to sound helpful while being anything but. I heard her in the hallway now. She's probably faking again, my sister-in-law said from somewhere outside the door, her voice bored, almost amused. You know how she gets when she wants attention. I pressed my cheek against the cold tile and tried to remember how to breathe. This wasn't the first time. That was the part no one would believe, that I had been here before, not this exact floor, but this exact feeling. The dizziness that crept in slowly, like fog under a door. The nausea that sat just below my ribs for days before it bloomed into something I couldn't ignore. My husband had chalked it up to stress. His mother had suggested I see a therapist. His sister had laughed and said I was the most dramatic person she'd ever met. I had believed them. For almost 8 months, I had believed them. My name is not important right now. What matters is that I was 29 years old, a second-grade teacher at a school 12 minutes from the house. My husband and I had moved into with his family after the company. He worked for collapsed overnight and took our savings with it. Temporary, we said, just until we get back on our feet. 6 months at most. That was 14 months ago. I had tried. I want you to know that. I had tried to be the daughter-in-law who folded the laundry without being asked and stayed quiet at the dinner table when my mother-in-law made comments about how I'd cooked the rice wrong or how the curtains I'd picked were the wrong shade of white. I tried because I loved my husband and I knew he was ashamed that we were there, and I didn't want to add to his weight. But there was something I hadn't understood yet, lying on that bathroom floor. Something I wouldn't fully understand until a doctor I'd never met before looked me in the eyes and told me the truth in a voice so steady, it felt almost rehearsed. What I'd been experiencing wasn't stress. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't the dramatic overreactions of a woman who wanted too much attention. I had been poisoned, slowly, deliberately, by the 2 women whose voices I could hear through the bathroom door right now, one of them still deciding whether or not to knock. But let me back up. Because the story doesn't start on the bathroom floor. It starts 4 months earlier, with a bottle of vitamins. My mother-in-law had a habit of leaving things on the kitchen counter for me. Little offerings that looked like kindness, but always came with a barb attached. A magazine with an article about fertility supplements, folded open to a specific page. A recipe card for dishes my husband had loved as a child. And one morning in October, a brown glass bottle with a handwritten label that read simply, Energy Support. She'd slid it across the counter with a smile and said, You always look so tired, sweetheart. I thought these might help. I should have asked what was in them. I should have looked closer at that handwritten label instead of the professionally printed ones you'd see at any pharmacy. I should have noticed that she watched me take the first one with an expression I couldn't quite read at the time, something behind her eyes that wasn't warmth, that I'd later understand was calculation. I took them every morning for weeks. Because I was tired, because I trusted that no person on this earth, no matter how passive-aggressively she commented on my rice, would actually harm her son's wife. I was wrong about that. The symptoms built slowly. First, the fatigue, which I dismissed as the fatigue I already had. Then the headaches, low and constant, like a sound playing just below hearing. Then the hair. I noticed it in October strands on my pillow, more than usual, wrapped around my brush in clumps that made my stomach drop. I mentioned it to my doctor, who ordered blood work, thyroid, iron. The standard panel. Everything came back normal. She suggested stress management. I suggested more tests. She said let's wait and see. By November, I had lost 12 pounds without trying. My hands shook when I held a pen. I sat down on my classroom floor one afternoon between periods and couldn't quite remember why I'd stood up in the first place. My coworker Diane found me there. Diane was a 5th-grade teacher with a bluntness that people sometimes mistook for rudeness and a habit of noticing things other people walked past. She sat down on the floor beside me without making it a big deal and just said, "How long has this been going on?" I told her. Not everything, not the bottle on the counter or my mother-in-law's hovering, but the symptoms. The fatigue, the weight, the shaking. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "Have you had a heavy metals panel done?" I said I didn't know what that was. She said she'd gone to nursing school before she switched to teaching, and that what I was describing, the constellation of it, the slow build, the hair loss, the neurological stuff with my hands, didn't sound like thyroid or iron to her. She didn't say what she thought it sounded like. She just wrote down the name of the test on a post-it and said, "Ask specifically for this. Don't let them redirect you to the standard panel." I have thought about that post-it every day since. My primary care doctor ordered the test with a skepticism she didn't bother to hide. "We'll rule it out," she said, the way you say something to end a conversation rather than start one. The results took 10 days. I didn't think about them much while I waited. I took the vitamins from the brown glass bottle. I ate the dinner my mother-in-law cooked. I sat across the table from my sister-in-law, who made a comment about my hair looking thin, and I smiled and said I was working on it. The morning the doctor called, I was standing in my kitchen at 6:45 making coffee. "We need you to come in today," she said. And the careful neutrality in her voice told me before any of the words did. My arsenic levels were 4 times the acceptable limit. I drove to that appointment alone. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't know yet what I knew, only that I needed to hear the words in a room where I could fall apart if I needed to, without my mother-in-law in the hallway parsing my reaction. The doctor sat across from me and spoke slowly and clearly. Chronic arsenic exposure. Not acute, not accidental ingestion. Chronic. The kind that builds up over weeks or months from repeated low doses. The kind you wouldn't necessarily notice until it had been happening long enough to show up on a panel most doctors don't order unless you ask. "Do you have any idea how this could have gotten into your system?" she asked. I sat there for a moment with the question hanging between us, and my mind went as I knew it would, as some part of me had known for weeks, without letting myself think it directly straight to the brown glass bottle on the kitchen counter. I told her about the vitamins, about who had given them to me and when, about the handwritten label and the smile, and the words, "You always look so tired, sweetheart." She picked up the phone and called someone before I'd finished speaking. The detective who came to my doctor's office that afternoon was a woman named Carol, mid-50s, short gray hair, the kind of calm that didn't feel performed. She brought a colleague. They asked me to tell them everything, and I did, from the bottle to the symptoms to Diane's post-it to this room. They asked if I still had the vitamins. I said I thought so, that the bottle was still on the counter at home as far as I knew. They asked if I could go home and act normally. I said I'd been doing that for 14 months. I thought I could manage a little longer. What they didn't know, what I hadn't told them yet, because I hadn't thought it was relevant, was that I had already started documenting things 6 weeks earlier. Not because I'd suspected poisoning, not consciously. I had started because my mother-in-law had a habit of moving my things and then claiming she hadn't, of having conversations that she'd later deny having, and I had grown tired of doubting my own memory. So I had begun keeping notes on my phone. Date, time, what was said, who was present. Small things. The vitamins were in there. The morning she gave them to me, the exact words she'd used, the way my sister-in-law had glanced at her mother and then looked quickly away. I sent that document to Detective Carroll before I left the parking lot. Going home that afternoon was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Harder than the floor, harder than the courtroom, which came later. I walked through the front door, and my mother-in-law looked up from the couch and asked how my day was, and I said fine. And I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table while she made dinner, and I watched her hands, and I thought about the 14 months I had spent in this house trying to be good enough, trying to be quiet enough, trying to earn something I was never going to be given, because she had never planned to give it to me. My husband came home at 6. I had not told him yet. Detective Carroll and I had agreed I'd wait 24 hours while they confirmed what they needed to confirm. I sat through dinner and listened to my sister-in-law talk about a trip she wanted to take, and my mother-in-law talk about a neighbor's failing marriage, and I ate almost nothing, and I smiled when I was supposed to. Smile. And then I excused myself and went upstairs and sat on the edge of our bed with the door closed and let myself shake for exactly 10 minutes. Then I stopped. And I started thinking about what came next. The following morning, Detective Carol called. The bottle had been collected from the kitchen counter while my mother-in-law was at her Tuesday morning book club. Initial field testing was consistent with arsenic compounds. They were waiting on the lab. She told me to go to school, to keep my routine, to call her if anything changed. I taught my second graders about weather patterns and the difference between cumulus and stratus clouds. I read them a story about a fox who was afraid of the dark until he learned to look for stars. I ate lunch with Diane and told her, quietly, at the end of the table after everyone else had gone back inside. She put her hand over mine and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" That was when I cried. Not about the arsenic. About that question. The lab results came back on a Thursday. Positive. The compound in the vitamins matched what was in my blood work with a specificity that the detective said, carefully, would be difficult to explain as coincidence. They arrested my mother-in-law at home on a Friday morning. My sister-in-law was there. I was at school, standing in front of 23 seven-year-olds who were learning to count by fives, and my phone buzzed in my pocket, and I looked down and read the text from Detective Carroll, and then I put my phone back in my pocket, and I kept counting. 5, 10, 15, 20. My husband called me 4 times in the next 2 hours. I let it go to voicemail. Not because I was avoiding him, but because I was not ready yet to hear his voice break, and I knew it would. I knew because I knew him. Whatever he hadn't known about what was happening in his own house. When I finally called him back during my prep period, he was sitting outside the police station, and his voice was exactly what I'd expected, hollowed out, confused, cycling between disbelief and something that sounded almost like grief. She wouldn't, he kept saying. She wouldn't do this. She did, I said. And then I let the silence sit there because there was nothing else to add. They questioned my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law separately. My mother-in-law, predictably, said she had no idea what was in the vitamins, that she'd gotten them from a health food store and simply passed them along with good intentions. She said I was oversensitive, that I had always had a flair for the dramatic, that any illness I experienced was the result of my own poor self-care. My sister-in-law's story changed 3 times. What broke it open, and this part felt almost too neat, almost like something from a story rather than a life, except that it happened was a text message. My sister-in-law had sent a message to a friend 6 weeks into my supplement routine that read, in its entirety, "The plan is working, she looks like hell, lol." She had not deleted it. She had not thought, apparently, that she would ever need to. The phone's backup had preserved it with timestamp and recipient metadata intact. Motive was established in the discovery phase. My mother-in-law had believed, with a certainty she'd apparently been carrying for over a year, that if she could make me ill enough, frail enough, broken enough, my husband would leave me. She had found someone else she wanted him to be with. A woman from her church. The daughter of her closest friend, someone she'd already begun mentioning casually at dinners in ways my husband had dismissed as her just being chatty. She hadn't planned for me to die, her lawyer would later argue. She had only planned for me to leave. The court was not interested in the distinction. I want to talk about the bathroom floor, because I skipped it and I shouldn't have. 3 weeks after the arrest, while the investigation was ongoing, and my mother-in-law and sister-in-law were out on bail with a no-contact order that covered me but not the house because she still lived there, because we had nowhere to go. Yet I collapsed in the bathroom off the master bedroom. My arsenic levels had been dropping since I stopped the supplements, but my body was still working through what had accumulated, and there were still days, bad days, where I would stand up too fast or turn my head too quickly, and the room would tilt in a way that wasn't right. That was one of those days, except worse. I was on the floor, and I couldn't quite get myself back up, and from downstairs, I could hear my mother-in-law's voice, clear as ever, telling my husband that I was overreacting, that I'd been overreacting from the beginning, that all of this, the police, the lawyers, the investigation, was something I had orchestrated because I wanted to hurt her family. Her family. Not mine. Hers. My husband came upstairs. He helped me up. He didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "We're leaving this house. Tonight." We stayed at Diane's for 2 weeks. Then in a short-term rental. It wasn't comfortable and it wasn't easy, and there were nights my husband sat very still in the kitchen, and I could see him working through something I couldn't help him with. The specific grief of realizing your mother is someone other than who you believed she was. I gave him space for that. I gave him space, and I kept my own counsel, and I kept my appointments with the doctor who was managing my treatment, and I kept adding entries to the document on my phone. The trial date was set for March. It came fast. I had thought I would be more afraid. I had prepared for it the way I had prepared for everything in the past year, methodically, quietly, keeping notes and gathering documents and talking to the victim's advocate the DA's office had assigned to my case. A woman named Patricia who called me every week and always started by asking if I was sleeping okay. I wasn't, mostly. But I appreciated the question. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Beige walls, fluorescent light, the particular stillness of rooms where important things are said in very flat voices. My mother-in-law sat at the defense table in a gray blazer, her hair done, her posture rigid in that way she had. That way that always looked like dignity from a distance and something harder up close. My sister-in-law sat beside her. When I walked in, they both looked toward me and then looked away, the same movement, almost synchronized, a thing they'd probably done their whole lives without noticing. My husband sat in the gallery behind me. He had not stopped coming to court. I want you to understand that. He had not chosen his mother over me. Some people do. I know. I had been afraid he would. He hadn't. The prosecutor was a young man named Marcus, who wore the same blue tie every day and spoke in a direct, unhurried way that made everything he said sound inevitable. He called the toxicologist first, then my doctor, then Diane, then Detective Carol. Each testimony laid another piece of the picture down until the picture was so clear that I could see people in the jury shifting in their seats, the particular discomfort of watching something undeniable take shape. The EMT who had responded to a different call months earlier, a neighbor who'd noticed my condition during a moment I'd collapsed briefly in the front yard, took the stand and described what he'd observed. When the prosecutor asked if my condition had been consistent with acute distress, he said yes. When he was asked if any of the adults in the home had expressed concern, he paused for a moment and said that, in his assessment, the response from the family members present had been notably lacking. The defense's argument was, essentially, that it was all a terrible misunderstanding, that the vitamins had been mislabeled by whoever had sold them to my mother-in-law, that the text message was a joke taken out of context, that I had a history of health anxiety that predisposed me to seeking explanations for ordinary symptoms in extraordinary places. My ordinary symptoms had included 4 times the safe limit of arsenic in my bloodstream. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. Guilty. Both of them on charges of criminal poisoning and reckless endangerment. My mother-in-law received 18 months in county jail, 3 years probation, and a permanent restraining order. My sister-in-law received 10 months, 2 years probation. The judge, in her remarks before sentencing, used the word premeditated twice. I sat very still when the verdict was read. My husband's hand found mine in the seat beside me, and I let him hold it. Outside, the afternoon was bright and cold, the particular cold of early spring that still has winter in it, and I stood on the courthouse steps and let it hit my face and breathed it in completely, all the way down, without anything stopping it. Diane had sent me a text that morning that said simply, "You've got this." Patricia from the victim's advocate office had hugged me in the hallway before we went in. My husband had made coffee before we left the apartment we were renting now, the one we'd found in January with 2 bedrooms and a view of a parking garage that I found, inexplicably, comforting. It was ours. No footsteps in the hallway that made my shoulders tighten. No comments about how I'd folded the towels. No brown glass bottles with handwritten labels sitting on the counter like gifts. I don't want to tell you I emerged from this unscathed. That would be a different kind of story, the kind that wraps damage in a bow and calls it growth. My hair is still growing back. There are still mornings when I reach for something and my hands shake slightly before studying. I see a therapist on Thursdays. I take a genuine vitamin D supplement that I purchased myself from a pharmacy with a printed label and a scannable barcode, and I read the ingredients list every single time, which my therapist says is a normal response and which I expect I'll do for a long time yet. But there is something else. Something I want to say to you: if you've ever had someone close to you look at your pain and decide it was inconvenient. If you've ever been told you were being dramatic when you were actually in danger. If you've ever folded yourself smaller and smaller to fit inside a space someone else decided was the right size for you. I want you to know that I almost missed it. I almost accepted the explanation they handed me. Stress, anxiety, overthinking. I almost swallowed that story along with the supplements and let it become the thing I believed about myself. Because it is so much easier to believe you are the problem than to believe someone who is supposed to love you has decided you are in the way. Diane asked one question on the right day. That post-it changed everything. Not because she saved me. I want to be careful about that word, because I was the one who asked for the test, who drove to the doctor, who kept that document, who sat through that dinner and smiled, but because she reminded me that my body was telling me something real and that I was allowed to take it seriously. Trust what your body tells you. Write things down. Ask for the test they're not ordering. Find your Diane. The morning after sentencing. I woke up early, before my husband, and made coffee in our kitchen with its parking garage view. And I sat at the table with both hands wrapped around the mug and let the quiet settle around me. Not the held breath quiet of a house where I was always waiting for something to go wrong. This quiet, my phone lit up on the table. An unknown number. I watched it ring and didn't answer it, because some habits of self-preservation are good ones. Later, checking the voicemail out of obligation more than curiosity, I heard my sister-in-law's voice. Thinner than I remembered it, stretched in a way that made her sound younger and somehow less certain than she'd always seemed. She said that what happened wasn't fair, that I had destroyed their family, that she hoped I was satisfied. I saved the voicemail for my attorney. Then I set down the phone and picked up my coffee and looked out at the parking garage in the morning light. I thought about what she'd said the day I came home from the doctor's office the first time, back when I was still trying to seem fine, still trying to take up as little space as possible. She'd looked me over in that way she had, the quick inventory that always left me feeling found wanting, and she'd said, "You really do look terrible." And then, almost as an afterthought, like she was being kind, "You should take better care of yourself." I took a sip of coffee. Outside, a bird landed on the parking garage railing and then flew away. Turns out I should have taken better care of myself sooner. But I'm taking pretty good care of myself now.